Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Deep Learning with PolyAI, the podcast that brings two humans together to talk about a lot of non-human things. I'm Damien. I'm here joined by Nikola, co-founder and CEO of PolyAI. Hey, Nikola, how are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. How are you?
Excellent. Doing very well. Doing very well. I've successfully weaned myself off mushroom coffee because I know you were probably wondering that. I am now back to regular coffee, and I couldn't be happier about that.
How are your energy levels?
They peak and they valley, yeah, as normal, but at least I don't have this fear of like some internal spore takeover. So, yeah. But I wanted
It's
to
what
take
one fear off your mind.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a very salient fear, I think. Speaking of salient fear, let's talk about moving it to the next generation of bringing AI into the enterprise. It is not an if, but a when. I think it's a foregone conclusion that if you are the person who has AI working for you in your business, that you are going to be far behind in the competitive race. Obviously, we would say some serious low hanging fruit include opportunities in CS and CX, specifically within the call center. But in general, this is going to beg the question of, okay, we're going to do this. We don't allow subject matter experts in our existing enterprise because this is such a new groundbreaking technology that a lot of the folks who are really learned in the space are out there building their own companies like Nicola Merchik. Um, so the question is do we build versus do we buy, which is the eponymous question that goes back since the dawn of enterprise and, corporate governance and infrastructure. We've talked a little bit about that dynamic and that dichotomy in the past, in a few episodes, and we've sort of touched on it, but I thought it would be a good a use of time to dedicate an entire episode towards talking about the pros and cons of building versus buying when it comes to conversational AI, generative AI, anything within the enterprise. What sort of, you know, uh, 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 what sort of personality or what sort of organizational structures do you think are most primed toward one versus the other? And just talk about a little bit of the pros and cons. So, I think just right off the bat, when it comes to AI in the enterprise, build versus buy, trying to be as neutral as possible, seeing as how we are a
Mm.
vendor of world class AI solutions. What is your topical take?
I mean, that's a tough one. And as you said, it is the oldest question in like software, right? And you've got companies with like big IT departments, big budgets, enthusiasm, interest in doing new things. Um, and it's very interesting to build conversational assistants. We're at a very interesting inflection point where the underlying technology, a part of it at least, has gotten way better, right? And that just allows people to be more effective at building it, right? So maybe before it would have taken them, 2 years to produce something, their perception, at least now, is that with a newer, more effective tool, they can do a lot more quickly, right? And I think it's like every kind of like technologist's, you know, like instinct to go and look at a bunch of vendors out there and say, now that we have this, I'll do all that they do and I'll do it better. Right. And I think, there's like the fundamental, like, trying to be not biased. One thing is like, go knock yourself out. Right. Like, build something, keep us on our toes, make sure that we have a reason to exist. Like, do we have a reason to exist? You know, did the just create like an AGI style thing that can do absolutely everything that we do in the back end? Hell, maybe it did. You should try it, right? I think, rolling out a full fledged voice assistant that does a good chunk of the work that your company does with clients on the phone, it's no small feat, right? So,
Right.
either way, either working with Poly or with someone else or on your own, you're going to have to put your house in order. You're going to have to understand what you're doing, how you're doing it, what your internal systems and integrations are. Then you have some choices to make, right? Like which channel first, how do you go about it? And then like, how do you report on how the whole thing is working? Is it working? How are you going to measure it? How are you going to roll it out gradually and demonstrate success? Hell, who are you demonstrating success to? Who's the arbiter of truth, right? Um,
Yeah.
is it a science project or are you doing something that your business really needs, right? In our space, at least, like you can do a quick take around how's your contact center doing, right? Do you have high attrition in the contact center? Are you struggling with those service levels, right? How fast do you need to fix? Like,
Right.
and then, I think like the real question to ask is, the same way you would ask yourself, like, why vendor A and not vendor B? It's like, well, why you? Do you internally have the right kind of talent to reproduce all this? And then the boring, fiscally responsible question to ask is, well, is that the best use of resources? If you've got such a great tech team and you're, I don't know, an insurance company, are those guys better off maintaining and building better risk models? Or should they be building a conversational assistant, right? What's it going to cost you? And how long do you have to fix the problem that you have, right?
Well, before we dive into the cost a little bit, let's go back to that internal talent piece. What are we talking about when it comes to the profile of we've I think often proselytized, is that the right word? The necessity for an AI competency center within an organization, especially if you're going to do a pretty significant implementation. But these people don't all need to have their doctorates in machine learning or, have a really firm grasp um, of deep learning and in our case, things like natural language processing and understanding its recognition dynamics. Like they don't have to be experts in the field, but what do they need in order to be able to approach an implementation like this if people were going to build internal?
Okay. So you're asking basically if we kind of like went for like the full takedown of like, why not build? You're asking like, what team do we need to assemble to build
Yeah,
like voice assisting?
yeah. If you're going to do this, you're taking a look. Obviously, a failed approach is to say, "I'm sure we could do this and do this with who we have." What sort of characteristics is an organization going to need within their org chart to be able to have a functional competency center if they even want to approach the concept of building?
Yeah. So I mean, like, look, the the main thing we got from LLMs, right, and like the way that people use them and how they can use them is that it's really like added to the democratization by allowing more people to do good work, right? And hacking around with prompts, changing them, seeing how behavior changes, it's a lot more accessible to many more people, right? Because all you're
Yeah.
doing is changing one giant text file, and then you kind of like you see it off to the races. And it's never been easier to build a demo, right? What you start to learn as you push this thing out into the market is you need telephony integrations. You need to understand the workflows. You need to understand um, just or architecture, right? Like what can you do programmatically? What can you not? And how are you going to do it, right? But then as you start exposing people who are not just your internal hackers playing with
Right.
then you have to start thinking about user experience. Does it sound right? And I think what a lot of people working with LLMs right now are really starting to feel is that there's a certain GPT voice, right? I was on a plane back from New York last week, and like always, I downloaded a bunch of uh, different YouTube videos, right? And one was on the history of Somaliland. And about 10 minutes in, like the voice of the narrator it just started grating on me. I mean, I knew it was text to speech, but I thought it was a text that someone had written and then just like
Yeah.
pull through text to speech engine. But really, then the form of the sentences, I was like, this is so generated. It had that unmistakable, lofty, unnecessary amount of words that comes from the fact that LLMs are trained on a lot of, fiction and similar kind
Sure.
of literature rather than the more factual tone that you would have in a documentary and definitely in an actual one-to-one conversation, right? Because no one loves a guy who goes off on a monologue and talks for half an hour, especially not if they're using complex sentence structures just to come across as more intelligent than they really are. And that's kind of like what
More Hawthorne than Hemingway out there, huh?
absolutely, absolutely, right? And if or like think Dostoevsky or something like that.
Sure.
Just like, could probably trim the number of words by 80% and not lose much meaning. Yet another description of the step. But there's something about it, right? Like where that user experience, it doesn't sound great. It's not how your agents speak. And what people are finding is that it's really hard to control for this because the safety mechanisms that say OpenAI has built into GPT 3.5 and 4 mean that it's really hard to mess with its like actual literary style. And if you can't even do that, then you're kind of stuck, right? Instead of
Yeah.
asking a yes or no question, you get like a disclaimer about, oh, as a voice assistant, I can't really advise on that, but I could do it. And you're like, oh my God, like this is not working. This is just out, right? And that's where like that netherworld between fun prototyping and like, oh my God, look, it works. Isn't it a miracle that it kind of works into like, you know, the real person interacting with your business? It's like, whoa, what is this? This is like,
Right.
I am not your experiment. I'm your client. I'm paying you real money for something, and I want to speak to you, right? I want
So
to get done.
maybe then, maybe the perspective is if you're looking at an internal communication platform where that tone of voice or that warm, fuzzy feeling that you're getting from this touch point with a brand less important, then maybe Build is a good vehicle. But you don't expect to carry that to your customer base and have them not perceive it just as you did, when listening to these YouTube videos where they're like, this is supposed to be something that makes me feel like my voice is being heard, that makes me feel like I'm a valued customer. And actually, it's kind of getting on my nerves a bit because I'm detecting that uncanniness to it. So, in
Really,
applications that are
it's
more
kind of like,
customer,
what is your starting point, right?
right?
Because
Yeah,
if at
sure.
the moment you actually have a contact center that's good, like you can't replace it with something that's way worse, right? Maybe if you don't have a voice channel and then you add it, and this is a new medium that people will be grateful to use because they have nothing else, then it may be a step up, right? It's all relative. But um, if you have a good contact center, you will have antibodies in your company fighting your science experiment.
Sure.
And, then other things will happen, right? So the UX is only one piece that I think many are now starting to experience when using LLM, mostly to build chat, right?
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and recently, I came across another um, large multinational company that had built a chatbot. And then, as they invested and brought up a team that was larger and larger, they started working on speech recognition. And they were told classical kind of like chat first vendor thing of like, let's build chat first and then we'll plug in speech recognition. You'll have a voice assistant, right? And then these guys were like, it's actually not working. It's not working that well. And the answer was, oh, of course, we need to tune speech recognition. So they hired a few people for that. And before you know it, a large company that is in no way tech company has a team of 60 people tuning a speech recognizer. Now, that's a large number of people. We at PolyAI have about 150 people in the whole company. Now, I can't really possibly see how
Right.
the best resources for that company was to go on that crusade because while fun, no doubt, especially for the person spending that money, I think, the investment officer, they're looking at, like, do we have to do this? Should we be doing this? Right? It would be akin to you and I deciding that this thing we're using for this podcast is not really the best software. And, let's take three of our best
Let's
engineers
make a studio. Let's build
and
a
build a
studio.
better one. Absolutely. Let's build something that Nikola and Damien will enjoy using a hell of a lot more. I definitely have like the top three feature things. Like I really want you to be centered in my screen rather than having to zoom you around so that your eyes are close to the camera so that I don't look like I'm losing myself in space. But is that really the best use of our time? I don't think it is, right?
Well, for organizations that have unlimited resources or near unlimited resources, so these megaliths, it's a little bit of a different story. They can afford to experiment. They can afford to dedicate. They can afford to build their own studio and app, right?
I mean, look,
But
by
for
all
those,
means, right? If you're like a Fortune 50 company and there's a powerful internal stakeholder whose only way to get that spark back into their, daily life is to rebuild poly AI inside, you know, a large insurer or a bank. By all
that's an
means,
odd spark. I'll
right?
say it right now. If you're that person, that's a very odd spark to have.
No, I mean, kudos to you. You're actually a very kindred spirit to us. We should talk. We should go to conferences together, right?
Sure.
But it's not really like, the other stakeholders' um, appetite or maybe, tolerance of that initiative will wear thin over time, right? And you will lose credibility because you're embarking upon, doing a master class in something that's pretty niche still, right? And you're going
Yeah.
to have to do a triathlon of machine learning that involves everything from like understanding and speech recognition to like reasoning. And, the other obvious thing in this space, at least, is like the both observability and analytics, knowing what you're actually doing, how it's performing. That's a whole different set of analytics tools that are built for voice assistants to understand how humans interact, like what are they doing, what's the next best thing to automate, where are we falling short, just the way we've run analytics internally, the number of fierce debates and disagreements, we still don't have a properly canonical view of what a good dashboard looks like for a voice
Okay.
assistant. And we've been breaking our you know head over it for 7 years now, right?
Right.
So I dare say that there probably isn't a canonical answer, right? And like just embarking upon all that with a few hours of your time, well, hell, maybe you are that much better than we are. And if you are, you absolutely should be doing this, but you're probably not.
Yeah.
So if you're just gonna invest shrewdly, and you should be buying, right? And you should be experimenting with vendors, and you should be making them prove their worth to you, especially if you're a large company, then you've got a big prize to dangle, right? So you should be um working these companies, gradually increasing your investment in things that work and, getting educated in the process. And hell, maybe you rebuild it later, right? Or maybe you don't, right? That then becomes like a pricing decision rather than a technical one. But for now, it's very much a technical decision, right?
That is an interesting point. The concept of buying in an experimental phase, but then if you feel like you've got a good sense after a limited deployment to go back and sort of build it yourself. We're talking about, like you said, the Fortune 50 out there. We're talking about a very limited subset of enterprises out there that have the ability of resource to do that sort of approach. And chances are, if they've done that with other technical systems, then they're more apt to do that with this because at the end of the day, AI is just another tool, right? So that's a very specific characteristic of a very small subset of businesses out there, but not largely what we see, the sort of buy to experiment, then build later on.
I mean, the real question, to be honest with you, especially for companies that have a strong like technical identity and a
Yeah,
propensity to build a lot of things, people who hope, are your companies that have, 5 to 10,000 developers and, really have like tech first DNA that wants to do this. And like, it's a positive thing. Like, it's by no means am I saying don't do anything, right? Um, but if you're that kind of company, then it's really more about, are you working with startups and smaller companies that have deep differentiation in one thing? Or are you using wider platforms, mostly by like large cloud providers who are trying to just provide, you know, a level of technology that's slow enough to give you control while giving you like, I don't know, LLMs, right? Or packaged up things that you can then use to build your own thing. And, like take a telco. A telco is a classic example of a company that will almost always build rather than buy. And it makes sense, right? A company like BT has, their own contact centers, but it will also have like their own like SIs, BT Global, that will go and like sell
sure.
to others, right? So for them, they're building technical differentiation, knowledge, so that they themselves can have a go-to-market. Their teams taking a product and running it maybe as a managed solution for someone else at great scale. So to them, it's
Right.
a tool of investment. It's not at all irrational for them to dabble in the build, right? But I think in this space, at least, we're not yet at a point where the fight is between three startups with platforms and the large cloud providers with platforms. We're still in the process of building the platforms, all of us, right?
Sure.
It doesn't really matter what your allegiance is and who you work with, right? Like it's just like who is carrying the development. What are the Manhattan projects around the world building a platform that can create like a good voice assistant? And it's really kind of like there aren't that many, and there aren't that many that care about it specifically. Many just
Yeah.
think that, AGI will take care of it. And hell, maybe it does. Let's see,
Well,
right?
that was
How many
another episode.
yeah,
We already touched on that
yeah,
another episode.
yeah.
Well, regardless of the fact that telecoms have like the tech savviness and the teams embedded in their organizations that probably have an accelerated amount of prowess for this type of platform, um, that they would do that. We're still talking about the issue of, a CX application to where that is it's commoditized across various industries, right? just because you have the technical infrastructure and the teams in house to be able to build this sort of thing doesn't mean it's necessarily going to pull off without a hitch when it comes to a customer facing application. And especially for an industry like that, utilities, these other largely monopolized spaces where they never cared about customer service in the past. Now they have to, because there's a lot of deregulation, a lot of decentralization around, um, you know, uh, 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 around those sort of utilities that are now, as a consumer, I have options, right? I don't have to necessarily go with this telecom, depending on where you are in the
I
world.
think that's
So
great
that's
thing, like allowing people in that industry to make further investments and to make the case they have to.
right.
I've spoken to probably thousands of like CX leaders over the past decade. They all care. It's not that they don't care. Utilities care about customer service. Every industry does, right? I think that, it's more about the level of investment decision made by someone else that allows those leaders to do it or not. But I think that like they're able to invest a lot more now just because it's a competitive edge. And this has been like a narrative for about 10 years now. It's not the customer service is actually like a key part of the product differentiation.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It and we just talked to Kristen Punter recently. We had her on the show, and she discussed about how, validating what you just said about in the utility industry, it's often ill perceived that that the companies just don't care, because it's like, you're going to be our customer whether you want to or not. They do strive towards having like good customer experiences, um, and so that's refreshing to hear. At the end of the day, outside of those business units and people who are tasked with that, I think there is perception that, it's not as important, which is why you're often faced with like an hour long wait or something when you're calling into your telecom provider, your mobile phone provider, et cetera.
Yeah.
Um, so it is kind of interesting to kind of push back to the fact that this is largely something that's going to benefit the customer experience, that more CX leaders are involved with that. And they are obviously um, vying for a better end user experience. As such, you know, the technical savviness of an enterprise or of an organization, or the progressiveness of their tech adoption, isn't necessarily a key factor as much as it maybe
In
historically.
fact, that it correlates. I mean,
Yeah,
you mentioned one of our clients just now, but like, most of our largest successes in our like multi-million dollar deployments come in industries that are not actually like build first, they're buy first because those leaders then, write down their requirements, they look at vendors, they make some bets, they gradually increase them over time, and then they end up achieving something great, right? In the meantime, the builders are mobilizing, you know, a team of everyone from machine learning scientists, engineers to UX people. They're like figuring out how to build poly AI inside a telco. And
right,
that takes time, as we know, right? And will they waver? Can they attract the right kind of talent? This is not the singular mission and pursuit of their company. And people know that. The best people know that as well. Will they want to work on it? Or are they going to look at it and be like, someone's going to pull the plug because
right,
we not delivered something in 6 months, in 12 months, in 18 months? Or, deliver the first thing and they'll learn what we learned like 3, 4 years ago. And then, is someone going to reinvest? Are they going to get another funding round effectively internally to do
right.
what a startup has to do? It's a lot of this, right? And I think with those industries, um, it's really hard for them to do this. I think, like, we'll see what utilities is. They'll do
Industries
more.
and business function within the industry, right?
Yeah,
This has been a battle, an uphill battle for contact center leaders since the dawn of time, is to sit here and vie for more resources. So the last thing that they want to do is be tasked with, conveying the value of a built um, program or project internally, and then just to try and like sell that off when things don't go right. That's got to
absolutely.
be
And
frustrating.
if it's an IT led initiative, at least in what I've seen, like IT around the contact center is not really typically the right kind of an IT team with the kind of resource and time to support something like this. So it's really much
Yep.
more, where I've seen people do this is recently would be like startups that are like, this is so cool. I want to work on it. Like, I'll just do it quickly. It's so easy to do it now. I'll just use an LLM, right? And then they build it and it's like, well, what? Like speech recognition is failing. The system is hallucinating left and right. your latency is 7 seconds. So like team of a dozen for each problem. Let's go. Let's work on it. Right. Um,
Yeah.
it'll take a bit of time.
All of a sudden, you got that podcast studio in your very small startup office. And who needs that?
I think we should do it. I think we should do it.
God, I guess we need that. That's the answer.
Yeah.
You mentioned a little bit about this, but sort of recap. If you are looking to buy it, buying makes the most sense. And from what we've been discussing, it does make a lot of sense for most organizations. Just go with established vendors who know the pitfalls, who know the ways to measure success, who can sort of continue that value proposition internally when assessing. Um, what what do you suggest for end user organizations to look for in vendor partners? You talked a little bit about it
Well,
topically, but let's drill down.
I think that like,
Integrations.
yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I think the other thing that just you have to really look at is, you know, if you work with us, if you work with someone like us, you'll spend a few $100,000, right? And like you'll have it up and running quickly. You'll see if it makes sense for your org and if it makes a big difference. And then you can
Right.
scale spend up to have really massive ROI later, if it makes sense. If you were to spin up a team of, 10 engineers, you spend that money and you're seeing the outcome later. And
Yeah.
I think you just have to accept that it's going to be slower. Is it going to be more cost effective? If you're looking maybe at some imaginary long-term unit price, perhaps, but that's like quite a lot to stake, like, such a big important decision on. So I think, companies, the other, of course, thing we see a lot of is people, no one ever got fired for buying IBM. IBM in this case was more really realistically applied to Google, right? Where
Sure.
it's just, yeah, I'll build something with Dialogflow and, like it's good, like can't be a very, very obviously wrong mistake. And I think, this was a hard thing to present maybe a year, 2, 3 years ago. These days, I think, look, it's not a case that we often even have to make because people understand that by getting that platform, it's like a bunch of bricks and planks and nails were delivered in front of your house and you're like, hey, do an extension. It's cool. It's all there, right? Um, you might need some help, but we'll call someone. And then before you know it, you're like building a construction company and learning how to build that. And you should have maybe just you know called the contractor to begin with and had them manage the whole thing for you. But
So essentially, it's if you find someone who's been around for a few years, who has some successful implementations of the belt, who have some, massive logos, who are obviously showing some success. So not just a poly AI, even though we have all those things, but someone like poly AI, it's very rational or reasonable to expect that they have some of those basics covered, the security protocols, the, you know, personal or the private information controls, the security layers on top of the bots. And just something that can scale out very well and not just, as you mentioned earlier, the commoditized LLMs that are out there available that make it very tempting to want to build your own. There's a
yeah,
lot of things that are kind of beyond the surface layer that you need to consider,
well, I think
which is why.
the real challenge you have if you are this kind of decision maker is there's someone in your team who built something and they
Right,
showed it to you. It's probably chat. Maybe they've piped it into voice. They're showing it to you on a laptop typically, right?
right.
Not even like on the phone. And they're like, look, it kind of works. And they'll tell you, say this, and you'll say it, and it'll work. And like, I think at that point, you're going to say, okay, like either you get smarter about like prompt injections and all of that, and you take a really good run at it, but you need to like red team your own team, right?
Right,
And definitely need to red team all the vendors that are they're going to come and try to sell this, right?
right.
So I think like you should just treat that internal thing as another piece vying for your business, right? Because that's what you have as a CX leader, right? You have a lot of spend that you spend on both human labor and software around that human labor, and you're going to work pretty hard um, to create an overall better customer experience for your consumers. You're working on behalf of those guys and on the on behalf of your business, right? So if you want to make the right decision, I think you have to scrutinize the internal builder as much as you're going to scrutinize the outside vendors, right? And the outside vendors, be they Poly guy or someone else, well, they'll probably have some reference calls you can make, and you'll probably be able to dial a few of the systems they built. You're going to see some examples of outcomes, of their dashboards, of the kinds of business outcomes they've driven, the integrations they've done, the timelines. And like when hiring people, hell, you should go and do backdoor references. You should ask around. You should ask
Yeah.
people, work with this company. And then internally, if you're going to make that bet, well, um, A, I don't think you should, but B, if you're really going to do it, then I think you really need like a clear set of gates that say, okay,
Yeah.
like more funding will be unlocked when you show this, and then that, right? And I think you need to get people to commit, um, to what they can get done by when, with what level of investment. And then, you pull the plug if you have to pull the plug the same way you would with a vendor, right? You're not
Yeah.
going to go and commit like, $20 million immediately, but you'll go and you'll spend like 6 figures and you might have an incredible thing that makes a huge difference for your business 2 months later. Hell, that's our, right? You can make us work
Right.
for it. And we'll do our best to prove that we're, that we can back it up. I think with the build initiative, these days, I think for that business decision maker, it's hard to actually test the internal team. And that's where I think the DNA of the company prevails.
Yeah. That's a good
If they're
point.
going to do it, it's the kind of company that's just going to come and say, we're doing this because we are X, right? That's how we do things.
Right.
And, if you're, a CX stakeholder in that situation, what I've seen in the past is people who get very frustrated with IT building something that they don't really need and telling them that it's great and them disagreeing. And then, we speak to them 2 years later and they're in a full buying cycle and they're like, we're ready. Like they call us.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that is because a staffing decision, something changed, some funding was pulled, that one builder left the company or moved on to building something else.
Sure.
And then they have a bit more freedom.
So key takeaway, no matter what you decide to do, be accountable and hold feet to the fire. The challenge with doing it internally is you don't even know how to measure success. And you basically have to entrust the implementation team, the building team themselves to sort of set their own standards for success, which, as you know, could have vastly different outcomes. So whatever you do, be diligent in holding your partner accountable. Makes a lot of sense. I think we're at time. This was a fun discussion, as always. I'm eager to discover any in office studio builders who want to build us our podcast studio. Please let us know. We'll give you a shout out.
Spend a lot of
Our
money building
sponsor
it.
for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But
We should
great
do
to
it.
talk with you.
Damien, we should build some hardware for it as well.
Okay, let's do it. Let's make it happen. All
Thanks,
right, Nicola,
thanks.
it's great to talk to you. We'll talk
Have
to
a
you
good
next
one.
week. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye.